there we go. So yeah, just quickly a little bit on how the session is going to run. We're going to start with an introduction to us, for those of you who don't know. Then we'll talk a little bit about sustainability and environmental impact and shelter operations and some of the thinking behind why we wanted to develop this tool. Then Stephen's going to talk a bit about LCA itself and some of the benefits in the built environment, and start to lay out a bit of our thinking into a roadmap for the development of life cycle analysis in humanitarian action. Then we're going to hand over to Aoife, who's going to talk about the proposed tool itself, and we'll end with a bit of information about how you can get involved if you're interested. So very briefly, just to kind of introduce us, we're the BRE Trust. BRE Trust is a research and education charity that works through partners to help improve practice in the built environment. Historically, we've done this through working with universities and industry partners, as well as governments, to develop standards and trainings that support good practice in the built environment. We have three main research themes that you can see there. We've got sustainability, well-being, and resilience, and we look to use some of our own expertise from the BRE group of companies that we own, or through using our university partners to help support projects that answer questions related to those themes in the built environment. And as a research organisation, and we're trying to position ourselves as a kind of knowledge hub that can connect experts of different disciplines, different areas of expertise across different sectors to push this agenda forward of improving practice in the built environment. So we're very much a kind of support organisation. We work to help support those that are doing the doing. And I guess it's worth just sort of mentioning a little bit more about our humanitarian program. Our humanitarian program is very much in development. We're looking to build a network of like-minded organisations and actors that have a shared goal of bridging the gap between humanitarian support and development action. So we're interested in things like stronger, safer, more sustainable post-disaster housing, better access to services, climate change mitigation and adaptation programs. And so we're looking to support and enhance ongoing activity in the humanitarian development fields. And this project is building on some of the work that we've done previously on that. So I guess our first interaction with the humanitarian sector was through the development of the QSAN tool. This was developed with IFRC, who came to us originally to look at developing a tool that would support sustainability in post-disaster reconstruction. QSAN is a shelter and settlement sustainability self-assessment tool. So it's a decision-making framework that helps practitioners and people working in the field to make decisions in the short term that hopefully have long-term sustainability benefits, and encourage long-term development in all sort of ways that you can construe sustainability, really. And as I said, we developed that with IFRC, and since its release in 2014, we've worked very closely with Catholic Relief Services and others to kind of pilot that and see how sustainability can be embedded more closely into shelter and settlement action. And so I think it's worth touching a little bit on what we mean by sustainability in the context of QSAN, because this has kind of helped to frame our thinking on the LCA tool as well. We worked closely with a group of shelter and settlement practitioners to develop this tool that viewed sustainability in a holistic way. So we wanted to consider the environmental, the economic, and social sustainability. And by addressing some of these long-term sustainability issues, we're hoping that you can hopefully avoid making decisions in the early response and recovery that might cause problems down the line. So for QSAN, we were considering this at the basic humanitarian level. So for instance, if you failed to take into account the impact that your settlement or your shelter operation would have on its surrounding natural environment, then you might be laying the groundwork for significant issues further down the line. As the community kind of grows and develops. So for instance, considering things like having sufficient grazing land for livestock, or having sustainable sourcing options for things like firewood. If you don't consider that in the early instances, that's going to cause a problem down the line. And that's kind of some of the thinking that went into the QSAN tool. But actually, that kind of logic extends beyond not just the local environmental impact, but actually the impact of the shelter settlement actions on global impacts as well. So looking at things like contribution to greenhouse gas emissions or a failure to mitigate carbon impacts. And actually in the context of sort of the going climate crisis and increasing focus around reducing carbon in the actions of everything we do, we thought that extending some of this logic of embedding sustainability considerations and carbon mitigation impacts from the very early stages of response can be applied when considering global impacts as well as local. And so in kind of exploring that a little bit further, we sort of realized that whilst we in the Trust are focused on this humanitarian response action and looking at things like QSAN and developing tools like that, actually in BRE Global and as an organization, BRE has had a lot of experience in developing tools that can support life cycle analysis. So over the last 25 years or so, we've been refining LCA methodologies and adapting them to different areas of the built environment. So you can see some of the things that we've helped develop there. We have things like Impact, which is a methodology for LCA analysis. We've contributed to tools like eTool or OneClick LCA that kind of simplify the life cycle analysis process for the construction industry. And then we have other things such as the Green Guide, which looks at individual products and allows you to compare products in terms of their impact. And again, this is very construction industry focused, but we feel that some of the concepts behind this can be applied to the humanitarian sector. And then we have BREAM and QSAN that look at sustainability in this wider, more holistic sense. And particularly important is LIST, the low impact shop fit out tool, which was developed by our strategic advisory team that was particularly aimed at developing a methodology for comparing different shop fit out solutions for small and independent businesses. And actually, that's the tool that we're hoping will form the basis of this shelter tool that we're looking to develop. So Aoife's going to talk a bit more about that towards the end of the presentation. But as I said, as we were kind of exploring some of these sustainability issues and looking at kind of the environmental impact of humanitarian action, we were speaking with Charles Kelly in the Environment Community of Practice and a few others, and kind of came to this idea that there seems to be a relatively good level of guidance and tools and frameworks out there to support decision making related to local environmental impact of different solutions, but the global environmental concerns are less well addressed. And with the update of the shelter sphere standards in 2018, I believe there was an increased focus on the importance of limiting the environmental impact of shelter solutions, including methods which reduce embodied and operational carbon of selected materials. But currently there's no tool or framework to support the measurement of these impacts. And we know there's some other projects that are ongoing that are looking at some of these issues, but we think that having a tool to make these decisions quickly is what's kind of currently missing. And as you can see on the bottom left there, the indicator 3 of Sphere Shelter Standard 7 is the percentage of shelter constructions using low carbon emission construction materials and methods. And the Environment Community of Practice released a briefing note on this, where they highlighted some of the things that needed to be done to achieve that standard and to achieve reaching and measuring accurately the indicators. So we're looking for something to do with a capacity to calculate the carbon emissions related to materials and procurement, the capacity to compare different options of shelter solutions and materials. And in order to facilitate that, we need to be able to define what low carbon emissions means. We need to have the available data on carbon emissions and construction materials, and we need some sort of standard tool for calculating carbon emissions. And that's obviously the bit that we're sort of particularly focused on, and some of the kind of the wider tools and frameworks that can support the development of a tool that can help answer this question. So I'm going to hand over to Stephen now, who's going to talk a bit about the role that lifecycle analysis can play in shelter and settlement operations.
All right, thanks, George. So if you just flick to the next slide. So yeah, so in the construction industry, cradle to grave impact assessments on a building's environmental impact is common. So there are several methodologies used to conduct an LCA on projects, which can consider various environmental impacts ranging from embodied carbon emissions, embodied energy, ecotoxicity, and other factors. So while there is potential to adapt these to a humanitarian setting, before this is possible, the correct data and sharing practices are needed to ensure the necessary information is available to conduct LCA in the varied context in which humanitarians operate. So life cycle analysis is a well-developed methodology for quantifying environmental impact from a variety of perspectives. So whilst this methodology is well integrated into the building cycle in more traditional building contexts, in humanitarian settings where the process is more variable, it is important to identify the key areas where LCA methodologies could be implemented. So LCA is used to total up the environmental impact of a product supply chain. So life cycle starts from the point of extraction of raw material. The product is then manufactured and processed into finished goods and transported to its final destination, which is known as cradle to gate. So LCA attempts to identify the environmental effects during all stages of the life of a product and produces a figure that represents the environmental load of a product. So in LCA, the energy and materials used along with the waste and pollutants produced as a consequence of a product or activity are quantified over the whole life cycle. ISO 14040 standard refers to LCA as the collection and assessment of the inputs and outputs of any potential environmental impacts caused by the product system throughout its life cycle. So LCA is important if you wish to gain a thorough understanding and perspective of your organization's services. It helps to gain insights on what is happening with your products and what you should do to improve them in the long run. LCA helps businesses within the construction industry understand where their business stands so that they can implement innovative solutions that will help them reach a level that is more eco-conscious. It also helps to decipher what is actually good for the environment versus what may be perceived as better. So in short, it helps consumers and building code officials make more informed decisions during the design and building processes, and it also drives innovation by revealing opportunities for manufacturers to improve a product's efficiency and quality. Could you just change the slide for me, please, George? Thank you. So the potential benefits of LCA for the humanitarian sector can be broken down quite nicely. Through revealing the source and magnitude of environmental impacts, product level LCA data can lead to increased innovation in the sector. Clarity in relation to cost drivers can lead to increased efficiency through material and energy requirements, minimizing the negative environmental impacts. LCA can also provide a common ground for internal goal setting and communication within organizations and across the humanitarian sector. The use of this type of analysis helps to enhance general transparency, which can deflect scrutiny from regulators and other stakeholders. The use of LCA can demonstrate an organization's deeper commitment to improved environmental impact. By improving environmental sustainability claims, you can strengthen stakeholder relations and attract new interest from potential donors. Risk reduction is a key part of LCA, so as it helps to develop organization positions around environmental issues to which their operations contribute and can increase awareness of potential liabilities. This also ties into how it can lead to improvements in design decisions through the evaluation of resources and materials and improving procurement decisions that significantly boost sustainability efforts. Could you change the slide again there, please, George? So, developing capacity first to quantify the embodied carbon in different shelter and settlement solutions, and then to integrate this information into decision-making at the field level can help to ensure that environmental targets are met and provide useful evidence for donors. Although at first this may appear to be additional responsibility in contexts where resources are already stretched, applying some of the concepts of life cycle analysis and embodied carbon considerations throughout the shelter process can enable humanitarians to demonstrate that they are being environmentally responsible, resource efficient, and contributing to the global push to reduce our carbon footprint across all activities. Variability of context and limited resources make environmental considerations difficult to standardize and can often be off-putting, seen as costly as time-consuming. A carbon footprint can be a reasonable proxy for the complexity that's surrounding reconstruction and quantifying environmental issues. By understanding the environmental impacts on this level, it can open the door to further understanding and awareness around the impact shelter practices have. By no means covers the entire spectrum of issues that are umbrellaed by environmental impacts, but it can be a good starting point. Effective methods of standardizing environmental sustainability in the construction industry revolve around the development of a balanced scorecard approach to decision making. As not all issues are as important as others when it comes to construction, a balanced scorecard approach allows a weighted importance to each issue in the context of the respective industry or scenario. An example of this would be the amount of embodied carbon linked to a particular product may not be as important as the human toxicity risks related to the same product. So this balanced scorecard approach helps decision makers with real data that can inform prioritizations more effectively. So for field practitioners who need to make quick decisions with as much relevant information as possible, the development of a balanced scorecard approach towards environmental issues would help with the prioritization of materials and construction approaches. Balanced scorecard criteria have been developed extensively for the construction industry, but humanitarian priorities are in many cases different. Therefore, an important element of demonstrating shelter solution performance is developing appropriate weighting for the issues considered. So developing a system by which different issues can be prioritized will allow field practitioners to make informed environment-related decisions in shelter operations. So collaboration between sustainability professionals and experts in the humanitarian field is crucial to developing a tool that is genuinely useful to decision making on the ground. The balanced scorecard approach will work if successfully and appropriately cater towards the needs of the humanitarian sector and decision maker. So developing close working relationships in the early stage of development of this concept will only help to develop a tool that is useful, but also efficient and easy to use, so that it does not hinder operations on the ground, but enable decision makers to make quick, greener decisions. So with the correct combination of on-the-ground data collection and expert input into sustainability methodologies, from a wider perspective, we can start to develop a priority list for practitioners, which could form the basis of a balanced scorecard approach to addressing environmental issues within the immediate response context whilst considering global challenges. So utilizing this approach, an LCA tool could help practitioners make decisions between two or more types of shelter designs, assessing both potential solutions and measuring their impact against a set of impact areas that are catered and weighted to the needs of the humanitarian sector. This will allow them to make the best decision for that particular scenario. By adapting LCA tools in this light, we can start to create a tool that is solely focused on humanitarian practices. As the data sets are not substantial enough to cover all bases, the tool will need to be flexible and dynamic in order to be useful across the sector in all scenarios. Considerations will need to be made early on in development to cover scenarios where data may be insufficient and certain procurement scenarios are just simply out of the question. By building these factors into the tool and making it simple to use for those that may not be experienced with this concept or methodology, then perhaps the concept of LCA can begin to develop and grow within the industry. The most important part is that the considerations of field practitioners are taken on board and that the overall goal of humanitarian practices is not hindered through the use of LCA concepts within the sector. So I'm going to hand over to Aoife now, who's going to talk a little bit more about LIST and its capabilities.
Good morning. So yes, as George mentioned, the BRE group have over 25 years of experience in the field of life cycle analysis, or LCA, and environmental impact assessments. One of BRE's flagship LCA tools is LIST, which is a low impact shop fit out tool. LIST is an online tool developed by BRE and originally intended for shops to evaluate and compare environmental impacts of their fit-out designs, including the embodied carbon of individual components for use in their processes. It helps designers, procurement teams, and project managers to choose materials which are fit for purpose while balancing the environmental impacts of those products. The tool uses information stored in an eco-event database to analyze embodied and operational carbon impacts of the products used on the project. After the assessment, each product is given an eco point score and embodied carbon values. Sorry, can you mute yourself? The basis of the components are entered into the product description, which then can allow for comparison of different solutions in terms of their environmental impacts. Our project aims to use the methodologies followed by LIST and to adapt the tool for use in the humanitarian sector with respect to the shelter building and design. To do this, we need more model data for typical components used in shelter buildings. George, can you click on? So list enables people to compare up to 4 products at any one time. This is a quick example I will take you through comparing 2 shelter options that I've just roughly entered into the system with the data that's in there currently. Firstly, the information will be asked about the life expectancy of the product and its functions, where the user will have the opportunity to list all the components to the end of the product's life. In this case, we're going to look at shelter A. So George, if you could. So this shelter has 4 components: the tent material, the poles, the pegs, and the ground sheet. For each component, the user inputs the type of material, approximate weight, and the dimensions for each quantity for 1 unit. Once the component section is completed, the user can input the materials used for packing, as well as the transport methods used to get the product to its final destination. Lastly, if applicable, the user can enter information on the operational maintenance of the products. All the information is then used to calculate the environmental impacts of said products against BRE's environmental profile. And click again. Okay, so LIST uses an environmental profiles methodologies to quantify, compare, and report on any given project's components to 13 environmental impacts, as well as the operational and embodied carbon. These 13 environmental impacts range from toxicity impacts to the effects of certain materials will have on climate change and fossil fuel depletion. The output of such calculations results in an overall carbon impact measured in kilograms per CO2 equivalents and an eco point score from each of the 13 impact categories. The lower both these values, the lower the environmental impact of that project's components. Click on again. So this currently offers the ability to compare products at any one time against these 2 metrics, allowing decision makers to see the benefits of using one shelter type over another, all in one tool. As you can see, with each of these products, there is a breakdown and an overview of each stage of the process, allowing users to identify the areas most likely to make the biggest impact to their project. Furthermore, in the individual report for each potential product, in this case the shelter, there is a pie chart detailing the breakdown impacts of each environmental category I mentioned earlier. Click on again. So although I have been able to roughly compare these 2 shelter types with the tool as it is, the data list currently uses is very much centered around Europe and fit for purpose in the UK, where you're probably not going to be building many shelters. To make this tool more widely applicable to the humanitarian sector, there are some areas of the tool which we need to adapt. Firstly, the data being used. We are currently looking at a model where we would have regional data sets which are comparable with each other. You could then, in the first instance, pick and choose which data set you are going to use, depending on the region of the world you're looking to build your shelters in. Another aspect we would need to look at is the logistical steps within the tool to ensure it is fit for purpose in the humanitarian sector. Currently, the tool assumes that all components are shared. This may not be the case in context where you could have 2 components for the same shelter coming from 2 different countries or areas in the world. Lastly, before a project is released, we are looking for the opportunity to run it as a case study or in small focus groups to test and evaluate it so we can improve it and ensure the end result will be fit for purpose in the humanitarian field. Currently, we are looking at the tool to assess and compare emergency and transitional shelters, but we hope to be able to build on this in the future. Our ambition is to adapt the methodology within the tool we'll be using to support the measurement of the Sphere Standard 7 and allow for comparison across solutions by field workers who are not technical experts, helping them in the decision-making processes for different shelter materials. Such a tool could also potentially be linked to other guidance frameworks, such as WWF's Building Material Environmental Guide, to provide a fuller picture of the environmental impacts of different material choices. The BRE Trust is looking to support the adaptation of LIST in order to ensure it meets the needs of the humanitarian sector, and we would be looking for support from interested parties to help us identify data sources that are relevant for the sector, the desired functionality of a tool, and to provide test case studies for the use of the calculator to showcase its worth in the humanitarian action. Back to you, George.
Yeah, thank you, Ether. So that was a bit of a whirlwind tour of our plans for the LIST tool and developing it into something that's hopefully useful. As Ether mentioned, we're looking for input. This isn't something that we want to sort of go away and do on our own and realize that we've created something that's not applicable to the people that are going to be using it. So we're really looking for people who, if this is something that's of interest, if you think this is something worthwhile, to get involved and to help us to develop this in the right way. So if you're looking for any more information or you want to be kept up to date with developments, please do email me, and we can keep you in the loop as to how this develops. We've also put together a survey to help understand what would be most useful in terms of the functionality of the tool, in terms of what kind of outputs you'd be looking for, and in terms of what exactly you'd want it to measure or how you'd like it to compare different options, etc. So if you have any thoughts on that, we'll share this link in the session notes, and we'll share the slides as well, so you can access the survey. Please do fill that out and share with anyone else who couldn't make it today, who might be interested. We're also looking, hopefully over the next few months, once we're a bit clearer on the development of the tool itself, that we'll start to put together a small working group of people that want to give their input to how the tool will develop. So if you're interested in doing that, again, please do contact me. And once we have something that's usable and ready to go, we'd like to have kind of opportunities to pilot the tool. So again, if that's something that you'd be interested in, to sort of help us to refine it and make it into something, again, that's useful and worthwhile, then please do contact. I think that's about it from us. I think we're also pretty much out of time. But yeah, that was a sort of an introduction to what we're trying to do with the LCA tool. And if you have any questions, please do either drop them in the chat and we can respond, or do get in contact after the event.
George, hi. Just a quick one. For some reason, I can't actually see a chat for this meeting. Would it be possible a follow-up email with the links that we can't click because they're on the video, the share screen?
Yes, yeah, sure, yeah. We'll share the presentation after the event. Yeah, sorry, I'm not sure if we don't have a chat, but yeah, no, we can. Yeah, like I said, my email was there. It's just george.foden@bregroup.com. But I'll put that in the sort of report, the after event report, and we'll share the link to that as well as the presentation slides.
And will that be shared with attendees?
Yes, yeah. I think we have one other hand up. Tom, you've got your hand up.
Might be muted.
Hi, Tom. Can you hear us at all? I think you might be muted. Okay. Oh, Simon.
I'm sorry. In the meantime, another question. I guess actually two questions. So the first one is, you mentioned that this is for targeting emergency and transitional shelter for the beginning. I was wondering why, given the number of tools that exist for measuring more traditional construction, which is what's done a lot out of camp, sort of rehabilitations. Would it be easy enough to, make available a tool that could quantify the environmental impact of a housing rehabilitation, which would consider things like concrete, steel, and sand, and just so organizations can start measuring as a first step. And my second question would be, in cases where, particularly for camp settings, where ecology is probably a bigger impact than carbon. So, has any thought been given to identifying potential kind of local environmental risks, and kind of quantifying or looking at how to mitigate those? So things like deforestation, pollution to local water sources, etc. Interested in your thoughts and work so far.
Yeah. So thank you. That's a good question. I think that we certainly in initially looking at this, we kind of decided that for this first step of the development of the tool, we would probably have to make some decisions about what this initial first step would do, because we're kind of looking at it as this is something that we're kind of trying to get some information on whether it's worthwhile, of whether the methodology behind it works. So that's definitely something that we want to look at longer term, definitely in relation to kind of the more developed housing. As I said, as you rightly mentioned, there are other tools available that are more complex. So the problem with that is because there's more input in the back end kind of developing that tool, it's more effort to kind of adapt it and turn it into something that would be useful for the humanitarian sector. So our long-term goal is definitely to look at something like that, but we wanted to use this as kind of an example of kind of a good test case for checking that this is something that's useful, and then potentially looking for a way to develop this, applying for additional funding or looking for kind of other kind of resources to bring in to kind of develop this further in some of those other areas. So that's definitely something that we're interested in looking at. And if you had any ideas on how we could go about developing that, then please do get in contact, because we'd be interested in that. And as for kind of the more local environmental impacts, I think that we get parts of what LIST can do. It can look at things like toxicity and issues to do with sort of environmental degradation in terms of what it might cause in the context specifically. And also, I think that with things like QSand, and there's other tools out there. I think the Neat Plus tool is another one that kind of looks at more of these local impacts. So for this specific tool, it's not something we're necessarily looking at, but as Stephen was kind of mentioning, we're hoping that kind of eventually we can have some kind of approach where you can look at these different issues and address them all, weigh them in terms of their importance to a specific project. That's again sort of a longer term goal for this project, and I guess the first step is to make sure that we are measuring everything that's relevant, and we just kind of identified the gap being the kind of carbon emissions currently. So the initial tool probably won't look at that as much, but again, that's something that we're interested in the longer term. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thanks.
Great, thank you. A couple of other hands up. Ella, I see your hands up as well.
Yes, good morning, everyone. And thanks, George and the colleagues, for the very interesting presentation. I have a question regarding our programs. Of course, with cash and voucher assistance, sometimes, not sometimes, but more and more, of course, the decision making of the construction materials and all that is in the hands of the people who are affected. And of course, we could support by giving more guidance on how to make the best choices and all that. But do you see a possibility of this tool to be turned into also something in the coming, maybe in the coming phases, to something that would also help the households who are not maybe construction specialists to make the right decisions? Or would you see this being mostly useful for the humanitarian agencies who are still managing the procurement or the material choice and all that. Do you see that adaptation possibility, or is that too far sought?
No, not at all. I think that that's kind of something that we're looking for sort of all of your input on, actually, because we I mean, one of the questions around what this tool will be used for is exactly that. I mean, we're trying to create, and List itself is developed to be something that is for use by people that don't have any LCA background at all. It's designed for use by people who are fitting out shops and kind of looking to monitor their carbon emissions whilst doing that. So the tool itself is designed for use by people that don't have any sort of background expertise in LCA. We in initially talking about this, we're looking at particularly making it relevant for shelter practitioners and kind of people in the field that are having to make decisions. But in terms of exactly how it's aimed, I mean, one of the conversations we've been having is, does it make sense for this to be aimed at the kind of the procurement level of kind of where the materials are coming in, or is it kind of something that would be used just as a way to be able to report, either to report to donors or to kind of report to kind of internal meal mechanisms to kind of just be able to assess what the impact is of a specific shelter option. And I suppose that might affect how the output would look. It's potentially something that, at least in the first instance, we would design with the intention that the shelter practitioners themselves would be using, but maybe it's something that the outputs could be used as a guide to give to whoever's making the final decision on the house, just so that they have a more informed idea of what kind of impact they're having. So there's definitely potential for it to be more focused on kind of providing guidance for kind of households that are rebuilding themselves or something like that. So if that's something that you think would be useful, then please do sort of let us know what you think about that, because we can kind of adapt the way that the tool gives its outputs depending on what would be most useful. So yeah, that's definitely something to consider. Misaka?
Yeah, thanks, George. I just wanted to add to the second question about the impacts of local ecosystems, the ecological impacts of them, so that they could be more substantial than, in certain cases, more substantial than the more global kind of climate change or global warming related impacts. I do agree with that, like George did. Especially in smaller scale projects, they can be way more significant. But on top of what George and Stephen added, I just wanted to say, like most of these impacts, they're extremely difficult to quantify. Like if you, as they emerge, like if you try to just, if you are too focused with quantifying them, you might oversimplify it. So what all these tools can do, right? Whether they're LCA tools or databases or whatever, is actually to inform your decision makers, inform your decision making, and finally, like the decision makers on ground should make their decisions a little bit of subjective inputs, from the input from the community and taking into the entire context into consideration. That's how that's how all these things work. So, as Stephen mentioned in the presentation, I think carbon calculations, other quantitative calculations and parameters could actually work as a proxy for like the bigger or the parameters or aspects you can't necessarily quantify, and then based on that you might have to do your investigations locally to kind of patch up and make the most informed decisions. So as George said, like there are, I think this tool also, like the aspiration would be to make it as broad as possible. But also there are certain other tools which actually look at those kind of qualitative aspects. I think one was mentioned. I'm from WWF, the Environment Disaster Management program of WWF. So we do have a tool called Building Materials Environmental Guide, which actually looks at which is more to the qualitative side than the quantitative side. So we do that tool does look into certain ecological aspects and more descriptively give these kind of impacts. So I think the challenge would be to use these tools in combination, understand what really fits your need, and make informed decisions. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Basaka. And maybe we can include a link to the Building Materials Environment Guide as well in kind of the sort of write-up report as well.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm conscious of time. I see we've got another hand up. We've just dropped our emails in the chat as well. So if you want to carry on, please do get in contact with us as well. But who have we got a hand up? Julia, would you like to ask something?
Thank you. Yes, I will be fast. I have two questions for you, actually. One is, at which design phase are you planning to act on? Because for what we've seen for LCA, it takes a lot of time to come into a full design, of course, and then once you receive your ranking or your results, then you realize your choice was not so appropriate, then it's a lot of work to go back to your decision making and reshape your shelter or housing project. So I was wondering, at what stage do you aim to have your tool working for? And the second question was, are you planning also to consider the settlement more than the shelter unit per se, as some of the impact factors might actually change if you plan for one cluster, one unit, or a bigger reconstruction? Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So yes, I guess on the unit side of things, I mean, at the moment the list works at the scale of sort of individual components for units. So you can put in the amount of units that you would be looking to build, and it would just kind of multiply by whatever that figure was to give you the new response. So at the moment, definitely in the first instance, we would be looking at the individual shelter level, but with the capacity to put in the sort of the number of shelters that you'd be looking to design. And again, that's kind of the first step of the tool, is that it would do that. And then once we've kind of established that this is something that's worthwhile and people want to use, we can look at maybe developing that into something that's a bit more useful for larger scale projects, or that can kind of give you a figure for kind of something that's bigger than the individual shelter. So in the first instance, it would be focused on the individual unit, but you would be able to play around with the number of units that you were building. And as for the kind of the stage in the process, I think again that's kind of something that we're talking about right now. It's kind of something that we want to get some input into. Again, when we first sort of were looking at it, we were thinking about this from the procurement side of things and kind of looking at it as when you're making decisions about what materials you're bringing in, you're making those considerations then. But obviously that's kind of based on the more traditional kind of construction methodology process, and actually, as you say, in kind of humanitarian action, often they don't follow that path, and actually there's other considerations that are more important than the carbon impact of a particular shelter. So I think that it could be used in the kind of design phase or procurement phase, looking at the different material components. But also it's potentially something that could just be used if you've kind of in a position where you don't have that kind of free choice of what materials you're going to use. If you have information about where that material has come from, it's just a way to measure and be able to put a figure on what the impact of this particular shelter solution is. Again, this is kind of in this initial phase, it's kind of the first step, which we've kind of seen as, at the moment, with the sphere standards and things like that, people are asking increasingly people are focusing on actually being able to tell what their carbon impact is. And the first step to being able to change your decision making based on that is to actually be able to accurately assess it. So it's really kind of, again, that's something that we could use a bit of guidance on kind of when these sort of decisions are made in humanitarian action. We're kind of coming at it from the kind of procurement side of things, but actually if another point in the process works better, then we can adapt it so that it's kind of more set up for that kind of questioning. So again, I think Stephen's just dropped the survey again in the chat, but please do forward on kind of any further questions or thoughts you have on that. I hope that answered the question. Julia, was that the same hand, or do you have a follow-up question at all?
No, I mean, I'm from ETH Zurich. We are talking with the SRU from IFRC because we are actually have kind of overlapping goals. So it would be nice to talk then maybe in another moment. And we are actually thinking, or what we have seen, that LCA is interesting and relevant, but it's very hard to convince practitioners to use it, because then it forces you to make significant changes. And if in the private sector you might have the luxury to do that, when it comes to the emergency in the humanitarian sector, then you have honestly other priorities, let's say, than considering necessarily the carbon footprint of your action. So we are pushing what is the early design stage as a phase to work on, so that while you are designing and while you are developing your shelter, or in our case, we work on informal settlements upgrading, so it's still a simplified using type, then you already have indications on your way through. So you're not forced to come back to the very beginning every time. Let's say you don't arrive to your definition of the installation when you know that you're actually doing something wrong. You can adjust every step on the way, and we have seen that this might be a way to make sure that the process is more easily supported by the user. But we can continue this conversation probably in another stage. Thank you.
Yeah, just jumping in on that, George, just in terms of one important thing of why it works in the construction sector is because it's often embedded from the get-go, so from the very birth of the concept of, say, like the design that you're building. So if it's embedded in the sort of thinking from the start, then it's actually almost like a process that's built into what you're already, as opposed to an extra piece of work, which is what we're trying to hope to do with this survey, and kind of design it so it fits well into humanitarian practice without actually making it more work on top of that. So if you are up for continuing the conversation around that, then we could definitely use some help around that kind of thinking.
Yeah, definitely. I think it'd be really great to kind of follow up and talk about that a bit more. Okay. Well, I think I'm conscious of time. Sorry, we've overrun quite a bit. Again, if you've got any other questions at all, I think the emails are in the chat, and please do get in contact with us, because we'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Again, please do share the survey and fill that out if you haven't already. And yeah, hopefully we look forward to keeping you updated as this develops. But I think that's it for now. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks all.